Welcome everyone to another episode of Kiwi Talks. My guest today is a 20-year veteran in the game industry who's worked on games such as Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, Uncharted 3, Mass Effect Andromeda, and more. He's currently art director at Fuzzybot. He is Eric Kozlowsky. How you doing?
Hey man, what's going on? I'm doing good.
Good to hear, good to hear. Thanks for taking time out and doing this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know game designers and even artists are always busy, I'm sure.
It comes in waves. Right now we're at my job, we're in a kind of like a nice steady period of things. GDC was a bit of a hectic kind of buildup, but once we hit that milestone, things at work have been kind of chill for now, and they'll probably start ramping up again in the summer. So right now is actually the perfect time. So
that's good. That's good.
Yeah,
I suppose the release of a game is the worst time because that's usually when the deadline is looming in. You got all the crunch and all of that.
It depends. Yeah, it depends. That's usually like the hardest. Like when you have like a hard deadline, it's like, all right, we got to get this done. But you could have internal milestones where it's like, if you're working with a publisher, they may want to see like a specific kind of milestone build. You could just have an internal kind of deadline that everyone wants to hit. And you're just kind of putting your own stress on yourself to hit something. You don't even have like an outward presence pushing in on you. So it just depends. But in general, yeah, usually like when you're leading up to ship is usually the worst of it. But it could strike at any time in game development. So
right. So how are you supposed to prepare like your leisure time then if some sort of curveball happens?
Curveballs are anomalies, but most times in a well-run studio, you have your production set pretty well where you can anticipate if something big's coming up, so like, again, to use the most recent example of, GDC, we knew that coming off of Christmas break that, January, February and part of March, we're going to be pretty, hectic kind of weeks leading up to that event. So, everyone kind of balanced their schedule around that. And we still had, we still had President's Day off here in the States, holidays. So it wasn't like, oh my God, like there was no crunch whatsoever, but it was more like, hey, we have like specific deadlines. So, if you're going to take vacation, take it after, that kind of thing. So, there was no surprises. Everything's planned in advance. And I think that's something that studios have gotten better with time. Some studios are still, crunch heavy and do bad at management. But I know for Fuzzybot, we try to plan things pretty far out in advance, so there's no surprises, so everyone knows, okay, like now's not a good time. And I tell my artists, at any time if they're feeling burnt out, like take a day off. Like Fuzzybot, like my company, we have a really generous PTO policy, so if the schedule allows for it, like I have no problem with artists taking it just like a personal day for mental health or whatever. And everyone's always responsible with their work, so there's no kind of like, oh my God, I'm in the lurch now because an artist needed to take a day off type of thing. So we manage it well. That hasn't always been the case with other studios I've worked at, but
I've heard some horrible stories from devs I've spoken to over the years. So anyway, I wanted to ask you about your first day at Retro Studios because from what I understand is you were chucked in the deep end from the first day, right? You didn't even know you were working on Donkey Kong until the first day you were there?
Yeah, that's correct. It was one of the first times, I think the only time I actually have ever joined a studio without knowing what I was going to be working on. Like I kind of went purely on the reputation of retro because I'm like, this is Nintendo. I mean, like, I'm going to be working for Nintendo. They could be working pretty much on any IP within the studio and I'd be thrilled, well, given a couple of exceptions, but for the most part. So yeah, I knew shortly after I was hired, it was announced that Retro was working on Mario Kart 7. So I'd assumed that, okay, I'm going to be working on Mario Kart 7. But that wasn't the case. I came on board and the whole team was working on Mario Kart 7 except for me and one other artist. We were the only two who were working on Tropical Freeze. But we didn't even have a name then. It was just, Returns 2. So yeah, I came in that day and was like, oh, I'm working on the next Donkey Kong game. And the rest of the team were working hard on finishing up Mario Kart 7. And I was a little jealous. I wanted to work on Mario Kart 7. It looked like such a fun project. I'm a huge fan of like low poly aesthetic. But it was also really fun to be part of Donkey Kong from the ground up, because this was also the transition into HD, which, you know, Retro hadn't done before. They, you know, they had been working pretty much on GameCube technology from, you know, the inception of the studio up until that point. So I had come from, you know, working at Naughty Dog, working at Double Fine. So I had experience working on HD games. And so that transition was going to require a lot of like R&D. Like, what does Donkey Kong look like in this, you know, higher res with normal maps and all the bells and whistles of the time? And how does the rest of the team get up to speed with that? So yeah, it was kind of a fun R&D period before we really got into building out levels and kind of like solidifying what the game was even going to be. You know, what the themes were going to be. You know, like at that point, we didn't even know like that it was going to be this kind of globe-trotting adventure. You know, everything was still up in the air. And it was kind of coming on board from, you know, the creative director and the leads and stuff like that as it went. But by the time the team rolled off of Mario Kart 7 onto Tropical Freeze, like a lot of that had been established, and then we hit the ground running and started doing some like, you know, the first thing that as a team we all did was work on the Mangroves, and kind of like try and take a little vignette of what that's going to look like and kind of say, okay, here's what a tree is going to look like in HD, or, you know, this is what the style is going to be. You know, famously, like my good buddy Sean Horton, he had come up with what the palm trees looked like in in Returns. And so that was like a nice kind of like benchmark of like the art style of like, well, what is our tree shape language going to look like in Tropical Freeze? You know, like what is that new look going to be? And so starting with like a tree seems like a simple kind of thing to do from an environment style, but I was like, okay, if we can get the style of this, then we could start to propagate that to other elements. And of course there was a lot of elements from Returns that art direction that carried over, you know, like we had to make this look like that game, but nicer looking. Yeah. So a lot of that carried forward, but there were new things that we had to figure out along the way as well. So like me and Elvin Schaefer, we were the first two artists kind of on that ground floor, while the rest of the team was on MK7, and then kind of figured out as we went. So
was there a little bit of an intimidation factor though? Like,
yeah,
overwhelmed and imposter syndrome, I suppose, even on your first day when you're given this massive IP, and particularly because you were one of the few people working on it as well.
Totally. I mean, you know, imposter syndrome is something that chases every artist. I mean, I feel it even in my day to day now. You know, I'm 41, and I still feel it all the time.
Oh, you don't look 41.
Oh, thank you. I'm gonna be 42 in 2 months. But yeah, you know, yeah, it's intimidating. You know, it's like you come in and there's this, oh, you know, this guy had worked on some big name games before, you know, so there's a little bit of attention. NeoGaf had done some like LinkedIn kind of pilfering and been like, oh my God, Retro hired an artist from Naughty Dog and a character artist from Vigil Games, and they started piecing together all these conspiracy theories. So like there was all of that on top of it, and it was just like, I don't know, I'm, you know, gonna just do my best. But yeah, you know, there's always kind of a pressure that every artist puts on themselves to do the best that they can, and sometimes that gets in your head and you start to overthink things. But you know, as a team, I think everyone was like supportive, and we kind of like vibed off each other's art. You know, I would see, you know, Ted do something or Sean do something or Matt do something and be like, oh my God, that's great, I'm gonna riff off of that, or that's really cool, you've solved that problem, now I can focus on something else. You know, like there were all these kind of like interlocking kind of elements that just came together, and we just worked really well as a team, and I think that's why the game is so seamless.
It is. It very much is. I know when I spoke to Ted, he said that his strength was mechanical stuff. In terms of, what is yours?
Organics.
That's
yeah.
good.
Well, I mean, I would say like for me, it's architecture, but more of like prehistory architecture. So like doing like temples and castles and ruins and stuff like that. And but I like to do a bit of everything, you know, like Ted and I really jammed together on one of the first things we did on the Mangrove level was I built this like big steamship. And since I was like well-versed in ZBrush, I did a lot of the normal mapping for that, and Ted is really solid at texture work. So I handed that off to him, and then he kind of like punched up all of my textures, and then eventually he was just on his own doing his own textures as well, like once he got in the groove of using ZBrush and kind of the high res techniques and stuff like that. So we kind of collaborated on that. I think we also collaborated on like a submarine and an airplane. So him and I collaborated on a lot of like he had a really good eye for the mechanical stuff, so like I would model it out, do some really rough textures, and then he would be like, all right, cool, I got this. And I'm sure he just like replaced some of the textures that I did, like flat out. But we worked really in tandem on a lot of that stuff. And then I think, as he said, we worked together a lot on the Alps kind of environment a lot together too. And him and I brainstormed like a lot of the visual language of that. I don't know who came up with it. I don't know if it was him and I, or if it came from somewhere else. But the idea of like having this owl theme, it might have came from him and I. It might have came from even him. I just can't remember. But like we were like, let's just put like as much like owl theming into the art as we could. So like we came up with like all the roof shingles should look like feathers, and then like we should do like all these like totems that kind of like have like owl motifs on them, and we built in some Scandinavian reference because it's in and then some Swiss reference, and so we were kind of like doing a lot of things. But it was just like I'm going off on a tangent now from your original question.
No, that's it's still interesting.
But yeah, but it was like just a very collaborative, and that was kind of the organic flow of working on that project. It's like, yeah, people had their strengths and whatnot, but it just kind of like flowed easily, and then you would pick up on someone else's strengths, and that would kind of increase your skills. And like textures have always been one of my weaker kind of skill sets, but like working with someone like Ted, like I learned a lot and kind of like punched up my skill set a little bit on that. And yeah, so it was a fantastically collaborative process.
So how you mentioned how you like to design ruins and temples. Mm-hmm. Would you make pitches to the designers to include more of it, just so you had an excuse to draw them
again
more?
Like architecturally, like anything like architectural I like. So I'll give you a prime example. So Windmill Hills, right? The way the level would start is we would always have like a kickoff. So the designer would design the gimmick of the level, in this case spinning platforms,
right?
So I'm pretty sure the Windmills was pretty decided on pretty early on. And as we get to like the middle of the level, the designer had like all these like windmills like in a vertical section. And I was like thinking to myself, like, all right, how am I going to design this from an art standpoint to have like these windmills going like this? And I'm a huge fan of Castlevania. And I'm like, what if we do our version of like Castlevania always has a clock tower. And I was like, I want to do like a clock tower, the Donkey Kong version of Castlevania's clock tower. And so I pitched like, what if you go inside a giant windmill and you see all the platforms are on the different gears that are moving the windmill around. And so that's how that section of the level kind of was birthed, is because I suggested that we do like a giant clock tower because I wanted to have my Castlevania moment. So that's exactly how that was born. So like a lot of times that's what the kickoff meeting would be. It would be the designer, the lead designer, myself, the art lead, any animator who would be doing animated bits inside the level, and they would play through the level and say, okay, like this happens here and this happens there. And as they go through, we would start brainstorming how the level is going to look, what are the different ideas that we want to do, and then equipped with all of that, I would go back to my desk and I would start working and arting up the level. And then we would have another, I think it was about a month per level. And so after 2 weeks, we would have a check-in. We would play through, look at the progress of the level, how it's, is this moving in the right direction? What could be improved? How is this looking? And if that was all thumbs up, then I would go through, finish the level, and then we would have a final playthrough and see if everything was, copacetic and given the thumbs up. And then of course there would be a polish pass later on, but that was pretty much how it went. And so that initial brainstorm meeting meant there was a lot of like ideas gestating there. And like as Ted had said, we didn't have concept in the beginning, so a lot of this was like I said, the Alps, like we had no concept for that, so we were just like, all right, we're just going to invent this whole cloth, but again, like to say your question about the temple, the first level I worked on the Alps was the rocket barrel stage where all the cheese wheels are happening. Rodent Ruckus, I think it's called.
Yeah, that's such a cool level.
Cool. And if you notice, there's temples in the background where all the cheese is stored inside the giant temples. And so that was, again, I was like, well, screw it. I'm going to make like these giant like owl temples in the background where these rats are storing all their cheese. So yeah, from the environment side of things, we had a tremendous creative freedom to do a lot of fun stuff. So yeah, it was pretty rad.
Yeah, sorry, from an environmental standpoint, where the levels where there's the destructive terrain, were they much harder to do than the standard levels? Like you say, with the cheese, I think in one of the levels you did the lava one, wasn't it? Where you're on Ramby, which is insane.
Yeah, that was a rough level, and then that was during crunch at the end of the project. So I think I only had 2 weeks to do that level instead of the entire month. Yeah, so it was, but also at that point you have a lot of assets already built.
Yeah.
So you're not building things from scratch. You're piecing together. It was still tight, but it wasn't like I was starting from zero and having to model and texture everything. It was like, okay, we have ice structures from the previous, snow levels. So I'm going to go grab that and make that. And every now and then I'd have to model something completely new or take a pre-existing mesh and, reconfigure it to what I want it to be. But to answer your question, like Destructible is always more challenging because you have to build it in pieces or you have to break it apart and make sure that it, connects seamlessly so that it looks like it's whole. But a lot of that you would be like, okay, how does this break apart? And it was all canned. It wasn't like, Call of Duty where you're shooting at a wall and it's all happening procedurally based on your bullets. This was, we knew exactly how it was going to break, and then an animator can animate it breaking when you hit it. And specific things like that. So it wasn't as difficult as say, okay, I have to break this up in all these little pieces and then the game is going to decide how it breaks. A lot of that now is done with programs like Houdini. It's like way outside of my kind of technical know-how. I don't even pretend to understand that. That's a whole technical wizardry there, but it's gotten even more advanced than that, where a lot of it can be procedural, given the right know-how.
Right. So what was your experience like working with Tanabe, for example? Like the Japanese designers...
Yeah, I mean, he was great. My interaction was limited. Again, he was more focused on design. Every interaction I had with him was pleasant. He signed my Hyrule Historia.
Nice.
Because he worked on Link's Awakening, which is one of my favorite Zelda games, and so I got him to sign that. But he was super nice guy. But Nintendo has very strict standards when it comes to design. So I remember specifically, this wasn't a direct interaction that I had with him, but he had come in and there was I'm trying to remember what level it was in particular. It might have been Windmill Hills, but the level was either too long or not long enough, one or the other. And so I had finished the level and they had just come and said, no, like it needs to be expanded. And so I had to just go in and like tear the level up and now reintroduce new art, stitch together where the old art originally ended, and so normally you make those decisions before art happens because it's a lot of rework to do that. But if the game wasn't working, if the design wasn't working, then art be damned. You have to go back in and kill your baby, so to speak, as the term goes, and kind of redo some part of it. And that was kind of the mandate from NCL, of design always wins out, even if the art is already done. They were willing to put a spike in the wheels to stop the machine from running in order to make sure that the design was perfect. And that was, I didn't work directly with him in that regard, but I remember when that came in, I was like, oh my God, you're kidding me. I gotta redo all this, and it's like, all right, pull up my sleeves, let's get to work kind of thing. So, but my personal he was great.
Yeah. From a structure standpoint, were you doing levels based on how it's played in the game, or were you doing it completely out of sync so you could be working on one level from one world and then another level from...
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, we did it in chunks. I mean, originally up until the very end, originally Bright Savannah was going to be the second world, not not Autumn Heights. So like things were, we were moving the where levels went based on playtests and what felt more challenging. But yeah, because I did a couple. I didn't do any levels in the mangrove, but I did like a bunch of art assets in there. So I did a bunch of the mangrove trees. I did the steamship, which eventually was kit bashed into other elements in the level. And then I moved on to Alps, and then they would move me on to like another. So like, yeah, I would jump around based on like what level was designed and where that kind of, okay, Eric is finishing up this level and this design is done with this level, so let's move him here. And now, granted, they would keep artists on levels they had familiarity with. So like I knew, you know, because I had developed a ton of the look on the Alps, so I did a lot of those levels. They had me do, I didn't touch any of Bright Savannah. So any of the kind of like Savannah levels, I didn't do any art on any of those.
Wow.
That's the only world I didn't do any art in. I didn't make any levels in the underwater world, but I did do the kit that artists used to create the levels. So all of the weird pre kind of history, again, temple stuff of like the weird statues and kind of like ancient Atlantean kind of architecture, that I came up with, and I developed that and concepted that. And because again, I wanted to do some cool ruins and stuff like that. So I came up with the little banana motifs on the texture and stuff like that, and came up with this kind of like pixel cubic kind of look for all of the stones that went in the background. So I created this kind of like Maya file that had all of these art elements into it, a bunch of coral and stuff like that. And then this way, when an artist was making a level, they could pick and choose, oh, I want to use this statue from here, and I want to use this kind of coral here. And so they wouldn't have to make that themselves. They could just use the kit. And we would do that for every world. We would do like a kit level, which isn't a level that you play. It's just a level showing the artist, hey, here's how these elements can be used in a map. And so like one of the levels that Ted worked on, was in the Seabrief Cove world, where there's lightning striking all of these ruins. And I remember he took one of the statues I made, and like he totally like reconfigured it and like redid it and like made a completely new statue with just the elements that I had made, and it looked amazing. Like he had rethought like how to, just using the kit that I had kind of made. And artists did also, I didn't do the entire kit, I just want to make that clear. Other artists kind of had worked on elements of that kit, and that's usually how it went. And to give a counterpoint to that, on the jungle level with all the juicing, I didn't really make any of that kit. So that was an example where other artists had made that kit, and then I made levels using their kits. And so I would piece together their stuff and be like, oh, cool, they have this big, you know, water tower, and I want to use that water tower in my level. So I'm going to take that water tower, and then this kind of becomes more world building there. Or I'm like, oh, cool, there's all these like cool redwood beams, and I'm going to take these redwood beams and then make a new platform out of them. So, you know, it was a lot of that. So sometimes you would be making a new asset completely from scratch. Other times you would have all of the assets already made, and then like a puzzle, you would take them and configure out your level and kind of use the elements to best. And when you got into a situation where the kit didn't fit, then you'd be like, all right, now I have to make something new because the kit isn't, you know, kind of like feeding into what I needed to do. And so that's kind of how it went. And so, yeah, you would be jumping around from level to level, you know, so.
You must learn so much from your peers, right? You must be writing stuff down and watching what they're doing.
I mean, not so much writing down, but just
like
observing.
Just keeping some sort of mental note,
yeah,
I suppose.
Observing, or even just like opening up a Maya file from something that someone worked on. You know, like I got to work on Aqueduct Assault, which is one of the later levels in the game, which is based on a level from Donkey Kong Country Returns. So I got to open up some of the levels from Donkey Kong Country Returns, which I didn't work on, and just seeing how those levels were constructed. You're like, oh, okay, they're doing this. They're you know, they're faking perspective, and they're doing cool tricks here. And oh, I see. And like, oh, okay, I'm looking at this texture, and I'm like, I see. You know, and it's like, so you learn just by seeing. And you know, it's a great shame that the game industry is so secretive sometimes, because like sometimes I learned from just seeing other people's art, and a lot of times game studios don't want you to share the raw, file. They
Yeah.
in particular, like when we finished Tropical Freeze and we wanted to share our art on like ArtStation, like a lot of that had to be vetted on what we could show. Like I couldn't like show like a Maya file wireframe or stuff like that. And so like it had to be like finished art from the game kind of thing. You couldn't really lift the rock and show all the, the warts and everything like that, to confuse my metaphors. But so, like just being able to see other, like methods of making games from other artists, like you learn so much. And then, like there were people there who had worked on the Prime series, so you're talking to them about like, oh man, wow, how did you do this? Like, like talking to Matt Manchester or Sean Horton or Albin, who had worked on Prime 1. He had been there all the way up and through everything.
Yeah.
Eventually he left, and now he's a lead over at Bluepoint. But at that time, up to Tropical Freeze, he had worked on every single retro game ever from its inception. So he was a font of information, on things, and a tremendous artist. So yeah, just working with him learned a ton. And sometimes you learn soft skills too. You just learn how to interact with people, and that's something as an art director that it's not a taught skill, but you learn it just by watching people who are good communicators and are able to teach you in a cohesive way, and then pass on that knowledge, because that's what a lot of art direction is. It's just the passing of knowledge. And so I learned a lot of skills just from talking with these, to my mind, giants that had created, games that I was in college playing. Like, I remember being in college, picking up Prime 1 and being like, holy shit, like I want to work on this kind of thing. So
yeah. Speaking of Prime, because I know you left retro because you wanted to move more into design and you felt limited.
Well, no, I mean, I left retro because it's kind of a, so the thing with retro and Nintendo in general is, I'll say this, is that you get to work on Nintendo IP, which is incredible. And like, I am the biggest, like I have a Zelda tattoo, like many people do.
Wow.
Like I love Nintendo. I always will. But the thing is, outside of your small contribution to like the level that you're working on, like I got to design like the clock tower windmill, like that's awesome. And I'm proud of that. But like, you are never going to get to make decisions on the core of the game, right? Like on, whether, Metroid Prime 4, this was, I left years before Prime 4 was a thing, but I'm just going to throw an example, like whether or not Metroid Prime 4 is, super dark and gritty or more anime influenced. Like you'll never get to decide that, that comes from Japan, like that's how it is. Nintendo is the parent company and there's an umbrella that you're under. And so that was like frustrating to me on a couple of situations where, I felt like the art team, myself, we had like these really cool ideas that we really wanted to push through, and we didn't have the authority to do it. And that's all I'll say about that, so it's like, so it was frustrating. And as I got older in my career, I wanted to be more in a position where I could actually help really define what the core of the game was going to be. And that's kind of what led me to, my career pivot into art direction from just doing, environments. So that's why I left in 2015.
The reason why I ask is obviously you left retro and retro wasn't working on Prime 4, and I know you're a Metroid fan.
Yeah.
But when they got announced to work on Prime 4, was there a part of you who was like, oh damn it, I could have been working on it?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely, without a doubt, 100%. I was like, son of a bitch, So yeah, of course. There's no doubt. And it's funny because when I joined retro, I wasn't the biggest Donkey Kong fan. I had played Donkey Kong Country 1 on the SNES, and I was a huge fan of that. I mean, when it came out, it was groundbreaking. But I never played Diddy's Conquest, and I never played Country 3. And I had played Returns when I found out I'd gotten the job interview, and I was like, all right, I need to play the last game that they made, so I should play this. But after working on Tropical Freeze, like I became like a diehard fan because like you just learn how brilliant those games are because I played once I'd gotten the job I was like I need to go back and educate myself, and I went back and played all of the original Rare games, and then I played through Returns, and I was like, holy crap, these games are brilliant. And the only reason why I didn't play Donkey Kong Country 2 and 3 was because at that point I had transitioned to a PlayStation and N64 and all that. But Metroid would have been sweet.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about Metroid Dread because I saw some comments you made on Twitter about it, which I found interesting. Particularly one where you said anyone that thinks Dread is better than Super Metroid is probably smoking crack.
Oh, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, I think Dread's a phenomenal game, but it can't hold the candle to Super Metroid.
So what are your thoughts on Dread after playing it?
I mean, I think it was really well designed. It suffered, in my opinion, from a couple of things. Controller spaghetti, where there was too many button configurations to do things, and like my hands are cramping playing. There was too many difficulty spikes and boss battles and stuff like that. And personally feeling, I felt like some of the environmental storytelling could have been like pushed up a bit. There were areas where I'm like, oh man, this would have been like really cool if they could have like, and I'll give you an example. Like, spoiler alert, you fight Kraid, right? It was in the trailer, and that was a huge moment. But like, they never explained what the hell Kraid is doing there. They never explained like why Kraid is still alive. And granted, there is coolness to that, like having that mystery of like why is Kraid here. But I'm like, wouldn't it have been cooler if like instead of that one creature that's in the background and like there was like the machines like operating on it, it was like a giant dead creature, and you end up finding that as a boss later on when the power comes on and the X parasite possesses it. But like, what if that was like Kraid back there? Because then you could start to say like, oh man, they're studying they've gotten the carcass of Kraid somehow, it's his dead body. And then like when the X parasite brings it back to life and then you fight Kraid, I'm like, that would have been a cool kind of environmental narrative storytelling, rather than just some like random creature that you've never seen before. So like little things like that. And I'm nitpicking, and Metroid fans are probably like, this guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. And that's cool. And I get it. Like I'm in the minority. I think Dread was a phenomenal return to form for the Metroid franchise. And I'm super excited to see where the series goes forward. I played it, finished it, loved it. But yeah, there was like little nitpicks there. Because when you think about how perfect Super Metroid is, it's like, they just deliver on a narrative through line in that game that's just like everything just flows together perfectly. The difficulty never spikes to where you get frustrated with it. It's just like it's paced really well. The environmental flow of going from environment to environment feels like really natural. So yeah, I don't know. I just don't think that as good as Dread is, I just don't think it just is as solid as Super Metroid is. And that part of that could be nostalgia. I played that game when it shipped in 94. I was 14 years old and it was just like, this is the best thing ever. So there is probably some of that. I admit that for sure.
But now, like, obviously, because you've moved into a different role, can you understand like other aspects of, obviously, rather than just art, but other aspects of design that are very hard? I mean, you talk about pacing, right? And Super Metroid's pacing being great, but it's actually rare that you play any game that has really good pacing, like all the way through. It's very, very hard to get right.
Oh, absolutely. And as an art director, I think you need to be dangerous in that you understand just enough to be dangerous. Like you need to know enough of like every discipline to kind of, communicate with those teams and stuff like that. So like, I'm no designer, but like I understand enough of design where I can, talk to designers and understand what their intent is and how they want to solve those problems and how that relates to the artistic side of the game development. But if you asked me to design a cohesive Metroidvania style map, like I would not know where to begin. Like maybe with enough time and effort and really studying games like Symphony of the Night, Super Metroid, Dread, Aria of Sorrow, games like that, I could probably eventually come to something kind of cool. But again, like that's a skill set in and of itself.
Yeah. I noticed that you've bounced around to a lot of different studios. Sometimes you're a permanent employee, sometimes you're doing contract work. But do you actually enjoy jumping around like that?
No, and a lot of that is just layoffs, you know, like just you know, you don't have a choice. It's the company, you know, like I was at Square Enix and I was a lead there and working on original IP, and they canceled the game and closed the development team that was there, and so that was like an I think like 6 or 7. I don't remember how long it was, but that was a really short stint, and just like, all right, you know, I guess I'd have to find a new job now.
Yeah.
You know, and some of it was contract where it's like, okay, you know, like I was at Bioware for 6 months working on Andromeda, and that was a mixed thing of like I wasn't really enjoying my time on that project, but also like I was like I got an offer to lead up Indivisible, and I was like, well, this is contract. I don't think they're going to convert me to full time, and my contract is 6 months, and so I think it's time for me to kind of not kind of ask for a contract re up, and so let the contract end and then moved on there. So it's a mix of unfortunate circumstances and sometimes just finding a better fit, where it pertains to my skill set.
But does that cause a bit of anxiety though? Like if you're having to worry about where you're going to be working in the next 6 months, or like, am I going to get laid off, or
I mean, layoffs are always a fear in game development. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years and I've, been part of layoffs. I've been part of studios that have had layoffs where I didn't get laid off, and that's stressful in of itself. So that's always something that you worry about when you're working in games, especially if you're working at an independent developer. I never really worried about layoffs when I was at Retro. Just never crossed my mind. And contract, you're kind of taking a chance of like, hey, maybe my contract doesn't get renewed, or maybe they decide that they don't need contractors at the end of the project, and they're gonna cut them out. And that's a calculated risk. I during the pandemic, I worked a 6-month contract at Armature on Resident Evil 4 VR. Yeah. And again, that was another situation where I was like, okay, this is a contract, and it could end with me getting converted to full-time, or it could end with me getting, just kind of let go. And you take that risk. And it could lead to anxiety, but I was in a good situation financially where I was like, even if I am out of work for a couple of months, it's not going to hurt me. So I could take that risk. I'm fortunate enough to be in that situation where, other people aren't as fortunate, and they, need a consistent job where even, a 1 month lapse in employment is going to be financially very difficult. I'm fortunate that I wasn't in that situation. The times that I've taken a contract, where I could say, okay, I could take this risk. And a lot of times too, you start to realize, okay, this contract's coming to an end. I should probably start looking for what's next and make sure that I have that kind of jumping off point, so I'm not caught, with my pants down when the time comes to find a new kind of position. So,
yeah, but it must require a certain level of skill to be able to move from studio to studio and adapt quite quickly.
Yeah,
every studio will have its own way of doing things, right?
Yeah, and that was the funny thing about when I joined Retro, and everyone was looking at my portfolio and my resume, and they're like, oh my god, he's worked on Uncharted. That must mean that Retro is working on a Zelda game. And I'm like, well,
that still happens now with all the new people being employed.
And I'm like, no, I'm just a versatile artist. I could do realistic stuff. I could do cartoony stuff. I'm adaptable, and I think to have longevity in this industry, you need to be adaptable. I mean, I think it's easier now to find your niche and kind of really settle into something that but I think when I was, working more as a production artist, I think I had more of a kind of like everyman kind of skill set. Whereas like I can work on Uncharted, I can work on Donkey Kong, I can work on Brutal Legend and not skip a beat. But nowadays I think you can get a little bit more specialized, for sure. So,
do you ever read like a lot of these rumors? I mean, particularly when you're at Retro and you see all the rumors and all the stuff that comes out, and obviously it spirals out of control. I mean,
we were laughing, we laugh about it.
It's just like, what? I mean, I've obviously spoken to a lot of ex-Retro devs, and I see some stuff on YouTube, and I'm like, this isn't even right. This is like wrong information, and then it gets compounded because it goes viral. So you guys must sit there and just laugh at it.
Oh, totally. And sometimes it's frustrating because it creates,
false expectations.
Exactly. And that,
Yeah.
I think that happened when we announced Tropical Freeze.
Yeah.
Everyone was like, oh, they're working on a Zelda game. They're working on a Zelda game. It's like, nope. And we announced Tropical Freeze and it looks phenomenal and it's gorgeous looking. And then people are like, oh, but it's another Donkey Kong. And then, people are shitting on it and, on NeoGaf or whatever. And you're like, oh, man, well, because everyone, thought we were doing a Zelda game. And it's like, no, that's, not what we do. So yeah, it's a bit both. Sometimes we laugh at it. Sometimes it gets frustrating when it kind of carries on for a little bit too long. And you're like, all right, I wish I could just get out there and say, no, guys, we're doing Donkey Kong. Like this is what it is. So, yeah.
Oh, that must be frustrating. How do you find moving from like realistic graphics to stylized graphics? Because obviously you've done stuff like Mass Effect Andromeda and Uncharted 3, and you even obviously the VR of Resident Evil 4 and stuff, and then you're working on something like Donkey Kong, which is like totally the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah, and and even when I'm art directing right now is very stylized. It's just a different set of challenges. Any stylized game, you have to take the core essence of what it is you're trying to communicate visually and strip it down to its necessities. And when you're dealing with something realistic, it's all about like the details and kind of like what is it that makes this object what it is, and kind of communicating that clearly and making sure that you have the right mix of details and the right amount of details where they should be and omitting them where they shouldn't be. And so it's just balancing the visual kind of language of each thing, like stylized stuff tends to be more on form and color, realistic stuff tends to be more on, like high frequency noise and how the object reacts to light. So you kind of have to just judge on what it is you want to communicate and just kind of make a judgment calls. And to be clear, like I'm so rusty on my realism. Like if I was to apply it Naughty Dog today, I don't even know if I would be able to, because like looking at what they did with like Last of Us 2 versus Uncharted 3, it's night and day. Like the technology has leapfrogged so far ahead that I'm in awe of what, like Naughty Dog is doing today. So I'm like, I don't even know if I can hang with those folks anymore, But I've always gravitated to stylized things, even like what I like to call like stylized realism, like I would argue that, what's a good example? I would argue a game like almost like, it's kind of an old example now, but Castlevania Lords of Shadow, right? Like you would say it's a realistic game, but I would call that like stylized realism, where it's presenting itself, it's rendering realistic, but characters' proportions are stylized. The environments are kind of stylized, exaggerated. The lighting is exaggerated. Whereas a game like Last of Us Part 2, it's like you're recreating reality, and there is some, they do push things as well in there, but they tend to go more on the realism side. So I've always gravitated to more of the stylized realism in terms of like my own art, or just going full on stylized. So for me personally, like if I was to, art direct like a game that came from, just my head, that's the kind of art style that I would want to do, is something that's like more of like a realistic-ish, but with like stylistic flourishes.
Yeah. So. But I suppose the thing about stylized graphics is it doesn't age the way realistic graphics do, right? I mean, you mentioned The Last of Us 2, and how it's leapfrog from Uncharted 3. I mean, if you go back and play some of those older 360 PS3 games, you're like, oh, this looks a bit dated. But with like a stylized game,
well, yeah, I mean, when Uncharted 3 shipped, I mean, it was considered, like state of the art. It was like, like the best looking game of I would argue of that year. You look at it now and you're like, oof, that didn't age that well. But then you look at a game like Wind Waker, and Wind Waker looks just as amazing, even before the HD port on Wii U. Like it looks amazing, just as much as it did when it came out in, what was that, like 2002, 2003. And so, yeah, like I'm always kind of hypersensitive to that, of like, pursuing technology for technology's sake. Like there is an art to that, and seeing like what Epic is doing with that Matrix demo and stuff like that. Like that's amazing. But if I were to work on something like that, I think I'd be bored to just try and recreate reality. I'd rather, create something that's going to inspire your imagination and transport you someplace, like that's, you don't see when you look at your window and stuff like that,
So how do you stay up with what's going on, like in terms of everything from a technological standpoint, from things from an art standpoint? Obviously there's always improvements there, and then what you got to play games as well to stay up with what's going on.
I mean it's like I said, again, I try to educate myself enough to be able to carry a conversation and understand, but like I don't know enough of it to, like, if you were to sit me down and say, like, okay, you need to make this environment now, I'd be like, shit, all right, I need to spend like a month in Unreal 5 and kind of start learning Megascans and get into Quixel. And so I understand the technologies that are going to, and I understand some of the tools that are being used, but the ins and outs, the day-to-day of how to actually build this stuff, I would have to educate myself in that. So I read up on things. I always constantly try to look at things through an artistic eye, even when I don't have time to work on my own art. I've been in a little bit of an funk when it comes to my personal stuff, but I always try to keep an eye on things from a creative standpoint and try to understand it and look at it, critically, and try to kind of pick it apart. And then when I don't play games as much as I would like, but I do pick the ones that I really like. I just finished playing Tunic, and Tunic was like outstanding. It was like such an incredible game, like visually, like minimalist, but gorgeous in the way they're using their lighting and their like depth of field. So even when I'm playing a game, I'm looking at it from a critical eye. It sometimes sucks. Like I sometimes just want to play a game, but I always kind of try and look at it from that, and then I'll take screenshots and send it to team members and be like, look at this. This is awesome. We should be referencing this, kind of thing. So, but then also just try to open myself up to other medium as well. And not just, I sometimes it's very easy to get tunnel focused on the game industry, but try to, watch movies, read books, go to museums, look at other forms of art, so that I stay well-rounded in my kind of my well of reference and taste. I think it's important to be a well-rounded artist and not just, looking at the kind of like coolest things that inspire us, like my favorite things of like my favorite Zelda game, and, I love Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, but it's like to look at things outside of that, to look at the, films that inspired those films and then what inspired that filmmaker. So it's like, the example everyone knows is like Seven Samurai inspired a lot of Star Wars. It's okay. Right. What inspired Kurosawa? I can go to the source. Wind Waker, like what inspired that art style, and the name escapes me, but there's an animated, I think it's a Japanese film, animated, and you look at it and you're like, holy shit, like this is exactly where they got their art direction for Wind Waker. And it's like an old film from, I think, like the 60s. And it's gorgeous, but like, so it's like, you sometimes you need to deconstruct and look at things and, see where the source comes from, just to kind of keep your mind fresh, so that when it does come time to create art, you're pulling from a well of knowledge that isn't just what you see like in another game and things like that. Because that's like fun, and it's also easy to do too. It's like, oh man, like the classic example is like, oh, the art director who played a new game that weekend and then comes in on Monday and is like, this is what we got to do, So like, and I trust me, the pull to do that is really strong. And sometimes you play something and you're like, oh man,
Yeah, well, that's right. You watch something or you play something, and that influences the design that you're working on currently. Sometimes,
yeah.
I suppose you have to know when to pull back on that and not go too far with it.
Yeah, I mean that's especially when you're also looking at something that's a direct influence. Like without going into detail, like the current game I'm looking at now, there's a couple of key points of reference that we have that are from other media. And you want to capture the essence of what that is, so people, when they see it, they're like, oh, I see the influence, but they don't look at it and say, oh my god, they just copied it whole cloth. Like a prime example, there was a bit of a kerfuffle on Kotaku, and there's like this indie game that's very clearly using the style of Link's Awakening,
right?
And it's gorgeous. Like the game is incredible looking, but like they are very clearly just copying that art direction. And I'm like, that's cool, but take that art direction and put a new spin on it. Try and maybe give something new to it, because otherwise you're just, kind of tracing over the work, kind of, so to speak. And
Well, can't you get sued for something like that?
no, you can't get sued for that, because they're not stealing the art whole cloth. You can't copyright an idea, So like, I think it's awesome to be influenced with that, and I'm excited to see a game, because I think the 2019 Link's Awakening remake is gorgeous, and I love that art style. So I'm excited about this indie game, but part of me is also like, like maybe don't directly copy that influence, but take the essence of like the tilt shift diorama. That's the kind of essence of what that game was, and then maybe put your own spin on it. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to do. And maybe when the game I'm working on comes out, people will think otherwise, but I think it's important to try and capture the essence of it, but also put your own spin on something.
Mm-hmm. So as your art director now, and you're more in a mentoring role, do you sometimes, does it motivate you to get better at your artwork? Like you'll see artists and be like, oh my gosh, I need to up my game.
Oh no, all the time. I mean, that's the imposter syndrome we were talking about earlier. It's like, but I firmly believe this is that sometimes the best artist isn't necessarily the best art director. And sometimes you don't want to put your best artist as art director, because I'd create very little art for the game, because I have my hands full doing a lot of like, reviewing and seeing things. And when I can, I do make art, and because I still love it. But yeah, I mean, all the time, I'll see something an artist would do, and I'm like, holy shit, that's incredible. Like, but then I'll ask them like, how did you do that? Or, take a look at the file as I'm reviewing it and be like, oh shit, okay, so that's how they're doing it, But then other times there's fundamentals where I come in and I'm like, no, it should be done this way. And my experience, understanding the fundamentals means that then I can communicate on a basic level and say, hey, this should be modeled this way, or the colors in this texture should be configured this way. So that wealth of experience comes in that way. So like, even though like I may not currently be at the technical level to, create like a character from like The Last of Us, I still understand modeling and the fundamentals of it, so that I can look at something and be like, that's a really clean mesh, or the proportions of that character, or the anatomy is correct on that character, so understanding the different facets of what goes into it means that I can then kind of use my experience and my kind of knowledge to guide an artist to get the right, along the right path to get the asset to where it needs to be.
But do you prefer? But do you prefer being in the mentoring role as opposed to being in the trenches more and doing the artwork?
Absolutely. I do miss making art. I try to do it on the side. Like I said, I've been in a little bit of a funk, but like when I get that itch to make something, I'll set aside time in my schedule to make it for the game, or I'll do something after hours and kind of work on it there. Because I think it is important to keep your skills sharp as an artist and kind of work on things. So within the style that I'm working on, within the platforms that I'm working on, like my skills are, robust. But like I said, like if you wanted me to work at Epic on the Matrix demo, like that's probably out of my wheelhouse. But I keep my skills relevant to the project that I'm working on. So everything that I'm working on in my current role, like if I was asked to be like, hey, we have an artist who's on, sick leave or something like that, you need to fill in, and I would have no problem stepping in and doing that. And I make sure that like my skills are always kind of like to that level of where I'm at right now. But yeah, it's hard to juggle sometimes to because it's a full-time job making art, and my job right now is, making sure that the schedule is kind of on track, and that I'm looking at the project from a holistic level and making decisions that not just affect the artist's work today, but affect their work 3 months down the line. Because any decision I make today on something could have ramifications down the road, and I have to be cognizant of that. So that's a full-time job in of itself. So, when you're creating art, you need to be focused on like the task at hand and not thinking at like a million other things that are affecting the project. So it's a different basket of thought that you have to kind of compartmentalize. And so it could get a little bit overwhelming to kind of switch gears like that. Like, all right, now I have to suddenly make art assets. But but I try to where I can, but it's hard.
I bet it is. It sounds hard just hearing you talk about it. I know. It's late there, so I'll wrap up. But before I go and let you go, where is the best place for people to follow you if they want to keep up to date with everything that you're doing?
I mean, I'm on Twitter at Von. I think it's Von_Koz. I think I've been taking a little bit of.
I could find out and put it in the description.
I've been taking a little bit of a break from Twitter for my mental health.
Oh, fair enough. It's pretty bad at times.
Yeah, so some days. No, it's at Von Koz, all one word.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, it's. See, I was thinking of my Instagram handle, which is another place people can find me. And on Instagram, it's _Koz, Von_Koz. So. Yeah. And then my personal website is landofkoz.com, and that has a bunch of my artwork on it, including the book that I just wrote is represented on there as well.
Arma, isn't it? Arma?
Armor.
Armor, yeah.
Which is Latin for weapon. Yeah.
Is it?
So, yeah. So it's a whole book of weapons and short stories about them, and that was like a multi-year process to fit. I think that's probably why I'm in a bit of a funk after working on that book. It was like a pretty long endeavor to finish it. But it was a lot of fun. And that was a situation where I went with like my art style that I want, which was more realistic, but stylized and, just kind of like telling stories in a minimalist kind of way.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
I wish I could go into detail more. I could speak to you for hours, but I'll let you go. I'll let you go have some dinner. And people can check out your artwork on ArtStation because it's still there, I believe, as well.
Yeah, it's a little outdated. I haven't updated it in a while. But yeah, there on my website is probably the most recent stuff. And and if you ever want to hear me wax poetic about random stuff on Twitter, I post from time to time. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, that is the show, everyone. Make sure you share, like, and subscribe. And until next time, stay safe.